So, how do we fix toxic masculinity? Socialism. We're done here.
Admittedly, that would be a pretty good start, but let me add a little bit of detail to that. At this point, I've made 2 videos about toxic masculinity. One probing its causes and another looking at its symptoms in my own life, and more broadly throughout the country in the form of mass suicide and homicide. And while I have mentioned some ideas to try to lay the groundwork of an answer, I still haven't answered the implied question. Well, how do we fix it? Broadly, I think the answer is to create a culture where it's acceptable to portray masculinity, as well as femininity, in a variety of ways, but also without enabling abuse and further toxicity. I think that at least part of the answer can be gleaned from Maslow's idea of self-actualization. I don't think that men want to play toxic roles, but instead that they are forced to by the overwhelming coercive power of a culture of masculinity that is, for the first time in recent history, looking rather unstable. I think that looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs is crucial to determining why masculinity is in such a fragile place. See, to reach self-actualization, you have to progress through a series of levels in a hierarchy. The first of these stages are our physiological needs: food, water, rest, and warmth. If a person is hungry or overtired, the strength of such a feeling can easily make further progression impossible by itself. As we progress through the later stages, remember that if you fail to get any of these things, you fall straight to the bottom. You can have a $70,000 a year job, a McMansion, and still, if you're so overworked that you're never rested, you're still stuck here at level 1 until you fix that basic physiological need. The next level, now that one is fed and rested, is safety and security. One cannot self-actualize if you are under the constant threat of violence, even if that threat is only perceived, such as in the cases of post-traumatic stress disorder. This also includes ideas like home and shelter. For the victims of domestic violence or the victims of home invasions, even this may not be enough for you to feel safe. So my first suggestion would be to give all Americans access to housing, food, and clean water. And not just paid access either, but access that is equal among social classes. To really enable our population to self-actualize, we have to eliminate poverty in the ways that allow people to fall below the standards that I've just laid out at least.
Socialism.
Because a person who is poor is at the mercy of their next paycheck. And even then, with a house, food, and a bed to rest in, if they lie awake at night wondering what they will do if they lose their job, they do not truly feel safe. The third level is related to love and belonging. This level requires strong social relationships and emotional availability. It requires one to be listened to not only in intimate confines, but in public spaces as well among friends. There's nothing except for cultural programming that makes a man's needs here any different than a woman's. Now, I've often heard that this next level can break a man. It's the desire for prestige and a level of accomplishment. To have done something, been someone in the world. Traditional society has framed men as the breadwinners out of necessity, because women in the past, even more so than the present, weren't paid even remotely similarly to men. For young men coming of age today, or even the generation before them, they might have had their father impress upon them the importance of a steady career on being a man, on being a provider. Starting with millennials, we've seen the expected careers within a single workplace shrink dramatically. For most of us, the reality that our parents may have lived about getting a good job and working for a pension until you can retire looked like a smoke and mirrors pipe dream. To men who are taught to base their value as a man on this, losing a good job can feel like losing everything. An identity, a self. But also add to that your house, access to food, and even perhaps intimate relationships. Men often exist at the top of a house of cards, unsure of when things in their life will come crashing down. and trying all the time to decipher which way the house will fall so that they can hit the ground running. But while they are on top of that house, if they can swallow their fear and allow themselves the ability to get comfortable, then they can self-actualize, which is just an acknowledgement that at that moment we are safe and secure in who we are, in such a profound way that we are finally truly able to be ourselves. There was an element to this that was added by 20th century psychologist Rodgers, who followed the pyramid I just taught you, but also believed that we need an environment that provides us with genuineness through openness and self-disclosure, acceptance through being seen with unconditional positive regard, and empathy through being listened to and understood. To Rodgers, these were as crucial to a healthy human being as light and water are to a young sapling. And to men's movement authors who coined the term toxic masculinity, these were the very things discouraged by the perversion of masculinity that they had identified. There's probably a term in there that feels a little bit peculiar: unconditional positive regard. Put simply, it's the basic acceptance and support of a person regardless of what the person says or does, which is something that I would say might be key in de-radicalization. We have to remember the Christian maxim, love the sinner, not the sin. A person can do bad things, and we can and should acknowledge them as such. But we should hesitate to call them a bad person because of them, because at that point we've lost them to whatever radicals will accept them. And do you know why? Level 3. Humans need friends, community, and level 4. Purpose to self-actualize. And radicals from ISIS to fascists are willing to give them a false community and a false purpose to believe in. Being a therapist, Rodgers designed this more for the clinical setting, for the doctor-patient relationship. So, frankly, it can be a little unwieldy outside of that. It can feel a bit like endlessly turning the other cheek and turning a blind eye to abusive behaviors. But I think that this can be dealt with if communities set clear boundaries for themselves. In this series, I've heard of a lot of abuse-related feedback, and I want to take a moment to shout out user Theremin for talking at length about abusive mind games and how to break out of them. I also want to shout out Pop Culture Detective, who was featured in my first video, for not only identifying toxic tropes in the media, but also picking up on wholesome masculinity in the media as well. Something we desperately need to be given more representations of than angry father saves kidnapped daughter by killing 15 men right in the face! Together, it will be us artists that define a better masculinity for our culture. This is our role in the revolution. I also want to give a much belated shout out to Sam over at Hooligan Comedy and Sam's video in his Mince Words series on toxic masculinity, because it gave me a lot of the information that I've used throughout this series and also served as an inspiration as well. Thank you. Another part of creating a new culture for our next generations is attentive parenting. We need to enable parents to be able to take more active roles in the raising of their children. In our current economic system, parents who stay home to take proper care of their children, to give them a place to feel safe in their lives. Parents who are able to take the time to understand their children and their turbulent emotions are not paid for their work as engaged parents. And whether it be through a UBI or mandatory paid leave or otherwise, we need to enable parents to take time off from their careers to make parenting a career of sorts, and not just their side hustle, especially during their children's younger and more impressionable years. Excuses like boys will be boys are probably made far more often when neither parent has the time or energy to deal with the problematic behavior. This is, of course, not only important for our young boys, but our young girls and our young NBs as well. All three will encounter men and masculinity, and they need to know how and where to set good boundaries with the men in their lives and with themselves. Attentive parents will also be better at seeing the small signs that might indicate that their assigned male at birth child isn't really a male. Not so that the parent can project a gender on them, but to be aware of their child's preferences and to give them more appropriate choices and options in their young life, to allow them to develop in a way more like they would choose to. But in the meantime, while we don't have the nurturing culture that I would want, we have the cultural petri dishes that are Facebook groups. I recommend wholesome masculinity spotting if you need a daily bevy of examples of masculinity being used for good. There's also a group where men compliment each other for no reason. And yeah, if you need your self-esteem built up in ways that can often feel to men as uncomfortably vulnerable, first you have to cop to having a problem that other people being nice to you can help, and that alone can be considered unmanly. And finally, the unisex, a group where everyone is super fucking nice to each other for no reason. I'm sure there are probably dozens of others, but those are just the ones that had the most obvious and self-explanatory names. It doesn't really matter the platform, though I'd actually recommend Vent if you're an Android user. Just find a local social group that's willing to listen and empathize and be there for people, or let people be there for you. But really, why not both? Finally, basically everything that I've said about the need to eliminate poverty in order for people to live actualized and complete lives applies just as much to women as it does to men. With a few minor differences related to the expectations of society on women to perform femininity in a certain way, which can be toxic itself. The difference is that feminism has done a great job of slowly breaking women free of gender norms. But the same gender revolution largely never happened for men. Or it's happening, and we are that movement. All I know is that we can do better than going through another generation without breaking the long chains that tie us to the intergenerational cycle of violence. Thanks for sticking around until the end. I really want to give a big shout out to my patrons for help making this possible and helping me to feel like I can do this. Like, really. I've been wanting to break out of the cycle of employment being a little bit neuroatypical and having a bunch of anxiety issues that can be really uncomfortable in the modern workplace, but also because I've always wanted to be a creator and an artist, and the following people are enabling me to do that. Swoletariat, Holly Smith, Callie, and Ranger Jenny. I just wanted to give you guys a special verbal shout out today instead of just running your names in the credits because you mean a lot to me. You're really helping me self-actualize every day, and I don't know what to say. I don't know how to thank you enough. But you're... Thank you.